Back to Proctor for a moment. 9 of 10, 7 of 8 from downtown. He's got 19 threes in his last 3 games.
You know, 13 of those in the last 2 is the most of any Duke player in the history of the NCAA. I'll say this, and just listening to what Jon Scheyer said. That is amazing. Now, obviously, he's at Duke, so it's a little bit easy to swallow because, you know, you're just the apex of the business. But there are so many expectations. There are kids that transferred away from Duke that were high-level players, too, before this batch came in. And him coming in and wanting to be a one-and-done player because that's the expectation, because that's what it's all about in universities like that. When you get to Kansas, Carolina, Duke, it's expectation. You saw what happened to the guys that went to Kansas this year. Didn't work out so well. For him to stay around, and as they're talking about Cooper Flagg and Nipple and Malawach, for him to have the game that he's having and mature like that, the one thing he spoke to is the relationship with Jon Scheyer. That's what people don't realize is important. Yeah. Now, is the necessary investment loot called NIL, is that necessary as well? Yes, it is, because that's what NIL is. That's necessary. But at the end of the day, him to be able to perform, to lead them, because I believe that they need an upperclassman to lead them. And the last thing I'll say is him, Sion James and Mason Gillis, those guys are every bit as important as those freshmen. And that's why Duke has an excellent chance of getting to the Final Four.
For me, it's all about like how Baylor was guarding Duke on the perimeter. They gave up too much space. You know, Tyrese Proctor, 7 for 8 from the three-point line. If you're a defender, the first time he hits 2 threes, they're like, all right, he's hot. They got to close the distance. Baylor did not adjust, and Tyrese Proctor and the rest of those Duke guards did the exact same thing. Kept going, kept creating space. They didn't close the distance. But one thing also, in addition to that, I want to talk about is the bench play. 20 points off the bench. I have to highlight Mason Gillis and Patrick Gungba. They played great. They played double-figure minutes, 8 points each, but they do it to glue guys. They got the offensive rebounds. They set the good screens. They do the little things to make sure the big guys like Nipple and Malawach and Cooper Flagg can excel at what they do.
This is something I've been talking about for years. We get so focused on recruiting classes and 5-star prospects, but often what determines our national champions is not that as much as it's who gets a borderline NBA prospect who could reasonably enter the draft or return to school to actually return to school and make an impact. And that is what Tyrese Proctor is for this Duke program. Throughout history, there's 2 teams that are considered one-and-done national champions. It's 2012 Kentucky and 2015 Duke, because they were both led by freshmen. But it's important to remember, 2012 Kentucky, 3 of the top 6 scorers were non-freshmen. Yeah. 2015 Duke, 3 of the top 6 scorers were non-freshmen. And you get to 2025 Duke, 4 of the top 8 scorers are non-freshmen. You can't do it with just the Cooper Flaggs and the young guys. You need roster balance, and Tyrese Proctor has provided that, in addition to three-point shooting at a really high level. And now Duke is exactly where we thought they would be, in the Sweet 16 and maybe just a few more wins away from a national championship.
To that point, is Duke the best team right now for your money, Chris?
And just real quick, you're right, GP. We color it differently now. We just say, like, oh, you need some older guys. It's always been that way. You always need it. Balance is the word. Is Duke the best team? They may be playing the best. I'm still going to go with University of Houston, even though the Gonzaga game scared me a little bit last night. But give Gonzaga some credit. Duke certainly looks like the most talented team, the most balanced team, and I would not be shocked if they made it to the Final Four or to the national championship.
Tough spot for those kids. They fall by 23, largest loss in school history in the NCAA tournament. They were down 17 at the break. They got popped in the mouth right away. You never really felt like they had a chance to win this game. And Omier, credit him, he did everything possible to try to climb back in.
Definitely did. He's a strong presence. This year he averaged 15 and 10, and he's been averaging a double-double since he started college in 2020. He started off at Arkansas State, 12 and 12. He got better the next year, 17 and 12. Transferred to Miami, went to a Final Four where he took a step back in terms of scoring, averaged 13 right there. That to me sounds like a selfless player right there, to give of himself, give up points, and then obviously finishing out his college career at Baylor. I have to tip my hat to him. He's a walking double-double from the beginning of his career, and hopefully he goes on to play some good professional basketball wherever else he goes.
Nobody wants to end a season getting blown out on a big stage, and so you could hear that in their voices and see it on their faces. But the truth is, I don't think that's the last time Duke's going to do that to somebody in the tournament. They're operating at an extremely high level, like we've talked about for weeks now. It was obvious in the preseason, just looking at the roster, that's the most talented team. in terms of NBA prospects and every other way you define such things. The question was always how quickly can the young guys come along, and how much can you trust a team whose best player isn't going to turn 18 till just before Christmas? Those were reasonable questions, but they're not questions anymore. This Duke team just shot 64% from the field against a Baylor program that is awesome. And I guess I would just settle right there. Baylor has now won games in the NCAA tournament 6 straight times. There are blue blood programs like Indiana that hasn't even won 3 straight games in the 3 straight years in the NCAA tournament since the early 90s when I was in high school. So this should not be taken for granted. This is not supposed to happen at Baylor. Historically, it didn't happen at Baylor. I know this feels bad today, but that's still one of the best programs in the sport.
You talked about it, 64% for Duke, only 37% for Baylor. Clearly, they weren't knocking down shots right away and got in a hole right away in this game. How about Duke? They've been incredible through 2 games so far.
They really have, and they're starting to separate from everybody else in the country in the predictive metrics. They shot 64% from the field against a Baylor team that's got at least one future NBA player itself, and so they're operating at an extremely high level. We've known for a while that the talent in place at Duke was bigger and better than the talent in place anywhere else in the country. The question was always how was it going to come together, and could your best player really be an 18-year-old in this era of college basketball? We're getting answers now, and they're yes and yes and yes and yes and yes. Just some numbers for you that are interesting. You remember UConn last season rolling through everything, blowing out everybody in the NCAA tournament. That UConn team landed with a net rating at KenPom of plus 36.43. That was best in the country, obviously. Right now, Duke is at plus 39.04. They're operating at a level even higher than the UConn team that blew through the NCAA tournament last season operated at, and that's why right now Duke is the favorite to win this NCAA tournament.
They were 12 of 22 on threes in this game, and again, we discussed it earlier in the show, but Tyrese Proctor, 19 made threes over the last 3 games. They win by 23, biggest loss in the history of the NCAA tournament for the Baylor Bears.